What do you think of when you think of a Superman reboot? What kind of things that are important to establish about the character when you're reintroducing him in a new iteration or version? I usually think about kind of him reconciling his identity with Krypton, his balance between being a human, being a Kryptonian, his connection to the people of Earth, kind of establishing that regular cast of characters that always shows up in every version of him, and some of those essential antagonistic dynamics he has with characters like Lex Luthor. And this is kind of where I feel like Superman, Man of Tomorrow, the beginning of the Tomorrowverse, kind of fails. Because I think it gets some things right, but a lot of what it does, a lot of the way that it establishes this Superman, it goes kind of wrong and it feels very artificial and half-baked. I think the best versions of Superman do exactly that. They spend a lot of time on his alienation, how he feels as an alien on this planet, kind of dealing with his idea of accepting himself and the way that he finds acceptance among these people. And they should have spent more time on his alienation and his psychology in this movie. The first 5 minutes feel like kind of a half-baked Cliff Notes version of this thing that we've seen before, and when it's done best, it's some of the most interesting stuff about Superman. And why even include it if you're just gonna gloss over it? Also, a weird choice of villain with Parasite. Now, there was something that could have been interesting about it because Parasite loses his humanity. He might have potentially been an interesting choice for a first villain, but he definitely would not have been the first on my list. And there's a reason that they kind of are sometimes relegated to sticking with Lex Luthor, Zod, Brainiac, someone who either has a connection to Krypton, or someone like Lex, who is just a perfect foil in every way to Superman. Opposite psychology, opposite ideology. They go head to head in so many ways. You just have this guy who hates aliens, and that reminder of who he is kind of something that also creates an interesting conflict for Superman. And Lex is in it, but he's not remotely on the forefront. Wonky animation aside, I will say Lex and Lois are actually characterized pretty decently well. I especially like that they chose Zachary Quinto to voice Lex Luthor. He brings some of that roboticness, coldness that he brings to Robot and Invincible and applies it to Lex Luthor. And it definitely emphasizes his kind of more methodical nature. However, I'm not sure that I'm really digging Superman's, Clark Kent's, the main character and our title character. Well, there's some charm to seeing a more prototypical Superman saving people without his costume and everything. And they do get some awkward Clark mannerisms right. There's just something kind of off about it, and sometimes it just feels like that shallow surface level version of the joyful Superman that we got in the theatrical cut of Justice League in 2017. It just doesn't feel like they really thought through the character and that they actually are focused on making him fleshed out and as human as he should have been. And then on top of that, you have Lobo in this movie, which, you know, an awesome character, a character that I love. Not sure he really had a place in this movie. It just feels like Parasite and Lobo both are sequel villains. They're villains you bring out after you've established the Superman and had him feel more steady about his worldview, kind of a bigger understanding of who he is. But they bring all this stuff out, likely in an attempt to differentiate themselves from other establishing chapters with Superman. And the weird thing is that this is taking a lot more walk before you run approach than the last animated universe. But by the time we got a Superman movie in that universe with Death of Superman, we've had a well-established Superman from these team-up movies, and you feel the impact in that movie. He feels so much more human. You see his relationships and how much it impacts Metropolis and the world and his teammates when he dies. So much about that shows the greatness of Superman, and I think that this movie fails on almost all fronts in that regard. There's just too many characters, too many subplots that don't fit, and then it leaves the main character shortchanged. They're introducing this new Superman, introducing the new cast, the new characters, the established characters, starting a universe, introducing Lobo, introducing Parasite as the villain. And then on top of that, they bring in Martian Manhunter. It sounds like a bit of an odd pairing, but there's actually an aspect that I think really could have worked and improved a problem that I focused on earlier, and that's Superman's alienation. If you think about it, him and Martian Manhunter, as far as they know, are the only ones left from their planet. They're both the two sole survivors of dead planets. And they could have found a really interesting angle to that, but in the movie, you'd kind of just get an acknowledgement of it and then they move on. Probably just the most base level way of bringing that point across. They say it out loud, have like a 2-second silence where they acknowledge it and look solemn, and then that's it. There's something inherently interesting to that similarity that I feel like was glossed over way too easily. And it could have been focused on, it could have been more interesting, could have been something that the writers could have found a way to make a deeper connection in that way. But instead, it's just another casualty of the rushed writing and just crowded nature of this movie. It really just doesn't feel like I got to know this Superman as well as a lot of other versions because it's so focused on setting up the world and checking boxes. And I really could have gone for just a more straight up classic Superman movie, another one for the books that I could rewatch and enjoy. And I love seeing Superman develop. I don't necessarily need to see his ship flying into space and growing up on kids. I don't need that. I like that we start basically after the first 5 minutes with a Superman who's trying to figure out whether he wants to be in our presence or not. But it just totally dashes right through all of that to get to the story beats that they want to tell. They include some things which, I'm glad about, but like his solar power, like some of his more classic things that you just can't shake, but it's another thing that goes back to, well, are they doing it because they respect the lore? Or are they doing it because they want to check boxes? And that's what keeps me at arm's length a little bit with this movie, is that I don't fully feel like it's trying to do more than just kind of give us a baseline for this new universe to set up. It's just a situation where there's no passion or love for the character in this writing, and it's honestly heartbreaking because so many movies of the last universe really worked for me, especially the Superman movies and that characterization of the character. The frustrating thing about it too is that I see all the pieces and makings for a good Superman movie, but it just fumbles the bag by going skin deep on everything, and then when you try to please everybody, when you try to do everything, you do nothing because you don't make anything work on a deeper level. Parasite could have been a lot more interesting, but they keep his connection to his family way to a minimum. And again, I feel like we're rushing to the sequel. Parts of it like Lobo, parts of it like Superman working with Luthor to solve this problem. It's all stuff that would be way better served as a second movie after Superman's established, after we know that Superman and Lex have animus towards each other. Because all Superman really knows is, oh, this guy's a corrupt businessman. They don't have a personal connection. And I feel like after establishing that, having them work together is a lot more interesting once you have that happen. I just wish they did so much more about this movie because there are traces of greatness in here, like I said. Traces of them wanting to tackle his feelings about his heritage, but it wasn't fleshed out, and his conflicts aren't particularly relevant to that subject. Him fighting Parasite, it's not an obstacle that puts him at odds with his heritage. Him fighting Lobo, despite the fact that Lobo's the last of his planet, it's not even something that's mentioned until the very end of the movie in one passing line. Luthor, completely irrelevant to anything because for the most part they work together. There's just nothing about it that really connects to his humanity. And without that base work done, it falls on deaf ears. Parasite is just sort of presented as a bad guy for Superman to beat. Nothing deeper, nothing really more complicated than that. They try to pull a little bit of your heartstrings by doing the cheap family angle when it was barely a part of anything earlier in the movie. There's like one part where Parasite shows up to his house and then scares his kid and he runs away. That's it, but it doesn't feel like it weighs on him because he's in weird animal form the whole time, so it just feels like a kaiju that Superman has to punch. Even that angle I think they could have worked if they made some kind of way where Superman reflects on his own humanity because of Parasite's loss in his own, but they don't do it. They don't go for it. All they do is have a very half-hearted attempt at the end of their fight. But even after that, it doesn't feel like it weighs on Superman. It doesn't feel like it really hurt him to have to put to stop an innocent man who's basically a victim of circumstance. All that to say that this is a very disappointing movie. I'm a huge fan of Superman. I love Man of Steel. I like the Richard Donner movies quite a bit. I'm a huge fan of the 90s animated series. I grew up on that stuff, and I grew up on Justice League. So to see such an inorganic, kind of forced way of reintroducing this universe, it's very disappointing for me, and I wish that they tried harder and that they made a more classic, traditional Superman so that I could get more excited when they bring him back up in the universe. But we're kind of just left with a little bit of a lazy attempt at rebooting the franchise after Justice League Apocalypse War. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. I'd love to hear, what's your favorite version of Superman? Which one do you think does things the best? I'd love to hear. I'm GM Light. Have a good one.